Hello, my name is Dale, and these are my books. The book we're going to be talking about today is called The Marble Faun by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is a bit of a classic, and I am going to be introducing lots of spoilers. The purpose of this video is to give a bit of a review of it, but also to try and help you read the book, to give clues as to what's going to be happening, how it happens, and how you can read it a little bit more quickly than you otherwise might do. First of all, I have to say that we have discussed this in book club, and originally 20 people wanted to come along to discuss this book. But as people started reading through the book, more and more people dropped out, and only 13 people turned up at the end. And that's because it's a very slow book, or at least it is in the beginning. So first of all, about the author Nathaniel Hawthorne. He's part of the New England bunch of writers that were around in the United States in the mid-1800s, and there were lots of talented writers doing their thing at the time, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of them. This is not one of his most famous books. In fact, his most famous book is probably The Scarlet Letter, but it's known as a significant work by Nathaniel Hawthorne, although everyone agrees it's not really his best. The first thing to say about this book is that I took about half an hour reading the first 2 pages, and the reason why I read it so slowly is that in the first 1 or 2 pages the author name drops. He drops lots of place names, and he refers to the names of particular statues. And this is really important for coming to grips with what the book is about. So, in the first sentence, he introduces 4 characters. I won't give their names, but there's essentially 2 women, and there's a man, and there's an Italian guy, Donatello. The American woman is an artist. They're all artists. And the American man is an artist, and there is also a woman. We're not exactly sure what her background is. All sorts of rumours. She could be from Britain, she could be from the United States, she could be from Latin America. We just don't know. She's a bit of a mystery, but is a very important character in the book. Donatello, now it begins in the first 1 or 2 pages, and these 4 people are in a museum. Now, this is a real museum, and the first thing you have to work out is that some of the names of the places in the novel and some of the names of the places as they are known today are different. So, for example, in the book he refers to the Marble Faun, and if you try and find the Marble Faun on Wikipedia, you might have difficulties finding this particular statue, and that's because these days it's called the Marble Satyr, and that's spelled S-A-T-Y-R. Similarly, in the first page or 2, he refers to the Capitol, C-A-P-I-T-O-L, but these days that area of Rome is normally called the Capitoline Hill. And similarly, the Capitol Museum is called the Capitoline Museum. So, they're in an art gallery looking at a statue of the Marble Faun. Faun is a character from Greek mythology, and he is a god of the forest, or a god of the woods. And he's often portrayed as a very, very good-looking young man, but if you look very closely, you realise there's a bit of animal about him to show that he's not 100% human. And in this case, it's his ears. He has pointy ears, and that is shown clearly on the statue of the Marble Faun, or the Marble Satyr. This is a slightly sophisticated version of the later Roman god, the satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, and with satyrs, they are more likely to have dad bodies, and they're more likely to be more obviously animal. You don't have to really peer to see that they're a bit animalistic, you can tell straight away. So that's that. There's a bit of a joke that among the three Americans, that their Italian friend Donatello looks very much like the marble faun, and in fact he may be a descendant of the model that the artist created. And they go to have a look at his ears, just to make sure that he's not actually a real faun. But he's very self-conscious about this. His ears are normally covered with his long hair, and so he sort of brushes that attention away. So the first page or two really requires a lot of reading and looking stuff up on Wikipedia to see the places that are being referred to, and also the names of the statues, and learning a little bit about the depictions of fauns and satyrs in art. By the way, the word satyr has given us a word in English called satyriasis, and satyriasis is the male version of nymphomania. And once upon a time, nymphomania and satyriasis were actually diagnosable psychological conditions. But these days, the words sound a bit dated, and presumably somebody would be diagnosed with sexual compulsion disorder or something like that. So, spending 30 minutes on the first page or two, that's really, really important. It is now challenging to say that for the next 130 pages, nothing much happens. There's lots and lots of discussion about art and reality and what comes first and how one reflects the other. And I think that there's probably a lot of interesting philosophical discussion there that someone more knowledgeable of the philosophy of art or aesthetics would be able to pick up on. But unfortunately that went over my head, and it went over the head of most of the people in the group. So, Donatello kills somebody. Lots of spoilers. Donatello kills somebody, and he does it because of a look by Miriam, and that is Miriam, one of the characters, is being stalked, and we're not quite sure who this stalker is. Sometimes it's one character, sometimes it's one description of a person, and sometimes it's another description of a person. But the stalker is making life pretty miserable for Miriam. And so Donatello suggests there's one way to get rid of this stalker, and that is to push him off the top of a high hill. And what happens is that Donatello looks at Miriam, essentially indicating or suggesting, do you want me to do this? Miriam then gives him a look, which Donatello interprets as, yes, push him off, kill him. So Donatello thinks that Miriam has been egging him on a little bit all of this time. When he actually pushes this man off a high place, Miriam is really quite shocked about this and says, no, of course I didn't want you to do that. But then, through the rest of the novel, thinks that perhaps she might have given that hint. Perhaps she did give him a knowing look. Somebody in the group pointed out something very interesting, and that is the parallel to the Adam and Eve story. And that is that here you have Donatello, or Adam, who's led to committing a sin by Eve. So it's the old story of a man being tempted to sin by a woman. Not necessarily by words, but simply by a look, such as the power of the feminine. It can be suggested as one level of analysis. What then happens? Is art a higher reality? Is it a dangerous illusion? Should we live for art? Should we live for life? And what about the role of guilt when we sin? Donatello at the very beginning is portrayed almost as a boy, almost like a demented boy rather than a young man. But he has now committed a very grown-up sin. He's killed someone. And it's suggested that the characters have developed because they're living with a serious sin in one form or another. Towards the end, we find out that the man who was pushed over from the high place, the man Donatello killed, is actually a religious brother And it's only the next day, when Donatello and Miriam go into a church, that they find the body of the religious brother laid out, and that's where he's going to stay for a day or so before burial. And during that display, some blood runs from his nose, because after all he's been dead for less than 24 hours. And it's recalled that there is an old story that if somebody's body is on display in a church, and the killer enters the church, then the body will start to bleed. And so both Donatello and Miriam knows what's going on here. Towards the end of the book, it works out that this religious brother is not a religious brother at all. In fact, he is a bit duplicitous. He was stalking Miriam, and the reason why he was stalking Miriam is only explained a few pages from the end of the book, page 333 of my edition, in fact. And what we find out is that this was an older man who was promised in marriage to Miriam when Miriam was a child. And this was the thing done back then, that girls would sometimes be promised to much older men. And in particular, where the girl was going to inherit a large fortune. And when Miriam became an adult, she didn't want to go through with the marriage, and so she denounced her fortune and then went off to live as an artist in central Rome. So that's about it. Everyone found it a difficult read, and one of the reasons why they found it a difficult read was because it's really two genres. It's a travel log genre where Nathaniel Hawthorne goes out of his way to describe things in tremendous detail, the various places that the various characters go to, and talks about particular works of art in tremendous detail. It might be worthwhile mentioning that the audience he was writing for probably haven't gone to Rome, and that members of the audience have not even seen photographs of these famous statues and these famous plazas in Rome. And that is why he spends so much time detailing all of these works of art. And in fact, this novel was a bit of a travel guide for Americans who visited Rome. And apparently what they would do is that they would walk around with their copy of the Marble Faun open, and they would go to a particular location, and then they would tick that off, and then they would just follow the instructions on how to get to the next location, and then they would tick that off, and then they would go into a particular museum and look for the name of a particular work of art, and then they would tick that off, and so that's how they would enjoy their trip to Rome. So it's, to us, it was a difficult book to read, and I wish I could say that there were beautiful, beautiful sentences in it, which made up for all of the detailed descriptions, which weren't particularly powerful. And I have to say that the language is quite acceptable, like you can read it and it's not too challenging, but there weren't many sentences where I felt, wow, that's just beautiful, I want to read that again. However, there was one in particular. This is in a chapter on page 37 of the book, so right at the beginning, when we're in Miriam's studio. And what the author wants to say is he wants to discuss the role of the artist. What is the role of the artist? What do they do? And what he wants to say is that the role of the artist is to show the everyday to the audience, to the viewer, and to show how everyday, ordinary things can be beautiful. That is the role of the artist. Now, if he just said that, we really wouldn't remember it. So what he does is that he tells a little story, and he's talking about something that was in Miriam's studio. So, he says, in Miriam's studio, there was a drawing of an infant's shoe, half worn out, with the airy print of the blessed foot within. A thing that would make a mother smile or weep out of the very depths of her heart. And yet, an actual mother would not have been likely to appreciate the poetry of the little shoe until Miriam revealed it to her. I think that's a beautiful line. Unfortunately, there are not many of them like that in the novel. So, if you've read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, you may wish to read this as a second book. You may wish to skim read a lot of the travelogue, or if you have been to Italy and you're very familiar with Rome, you may read about all the place names and the particular statues that you've seen and really, really quite enjoy it. Just one final point about this book. There was someone there who was able to speak about this book, that is in the book club that I went to tonight, who was able to speak about this book in a lot of detail. And there has in fact been a lot of analysis around this book, not only about the gender relations, but also about the secular and the holy. There is a lot of Catholic imagery in this. There's a lot of religious imagery, and also the tension or the reciprocal relationship between the old world and the new world, about Americans belonging to the new world, being in Italy, part of the old world. And it does make me wonder, is that because the work is really complex and subtle, and therefore it's possible to have lots and lots of analyses of the book? Or is it just because the work is a bit mediocre, but there have been lots of academics over the decades who have decided to focus on this particular book or this particular author, and therefore there's just lots of writing and commentary about it? I don't know, it depends how highly you rate the book. So that's my personal take on Nathaniel Hawthorne. I hope it's been a help, and thanks for listening.